In the skies over the Pacific in June 1942, a new landscape was unfolding. Indeed, an invisible battlefield, laden with omens. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sitting on the decks of their aircraft carriers, the horizon held the promise of glory. They were the masters of that ocean, considered invincible. 6 months of overwhelming victories had cemented this conviction. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, a trail of conquest that seemed endless. But that morning, something was different. A strange noise shattered reality, a hum that didn't come from their own engines. Imagine the scene. A Japanese officer scanning the sky with his binoculars. He's not looking for seagulls, he's looking for destiny. And then he sees them. Dots. Dark dots materializing against the pale blue, descending from the clouds like angels of death. They're not allies. They're actually American planes. But how? The outrage was clear. The American fleet was scattered, wounded, thousands of miles away. What were those planes doing there? Where had they come from? In that moment of shock, disbelief grips the body, and the arrogance of an empire begins to crumble. What followed was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a brutal twist of fate, orchestrated not just at sea, but in the skies, in a lethal battle between men and machines. This is not just the story of a single engagement, it is the story of the Battle of Midway, the story of how the sacrifice of a few paved the way for the victory of many, and how in a few minutes, the course of the war in the Pacific was irrevocably altered. It was dawn on June 4th, 1942. Midway Island, a coral atoll barely 4 square miles in size, inspired both fear and hope. To the American Marines and pilots stationed there, every wave crashing against the shore sounded like the harbinger of an invasion. Midway was no tropical paradise, it was an outpost, a sentinel of sand and rock whose sole function was to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Its position was its value. Located halfway between Asia and North America, it was the key that could either block or open the door to Hawaii. And Admiral Issaruku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, wanted it. The Japanese plan was a complex and audacious masterpiece. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to lure the American fleet north. Meanwhile, the main force, the mighty Kido Butai, with 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, would emerge from the northwest to pulverize Midway's defenses, setting the stage for a massive invasion force coming close behind. Yamamoto didn't just want Midway, he wanted to annihilate what remained of the American carrier fleet, forcing the United States into a humiliating peace. The plan was nearly perfect, but it contained 2 fatal flaws invisible to the Japanese leadership. The first was arrogance, a disease that blinds generals and admirals. Continuous victory had convinced the high command that the U.S. Navy was incapable of a coordinated and effective response. They had underestimated the enemy. The second flaw, and the most critical, was being cultivated in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor known as Hypo Station. There, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had achieved the impossible. They were reading the Japanese Navy's coded messages. The supposedly unbreakable JN-25 code was revealing its secrets. The Americans knew the plan. They knew the target, Midway, identified by the code AF. They knew the dates. They knew the composition of the attack fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now held the most powerful information of the war. He would not fall for the Aleutian trap. Instead, he prepared his own trap. He had only 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. the latter fresh from emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, a ship the Japanese believed to be at the bottom of the sea after the Battle of the Coral Sea. His force was inferior in numbers, but superior in knowledge. Nimitz positioned his ships northeast of Midway, at a point in the ocean nicknamed Point Luck, out of range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, and waited. The chessboard was set. On one side, an overwhelming force, confident in its brute strength and a complex plan. On the other, a smaller force, betting everything on a single precious piece of information. The gray sky that dawn of June 4th was no ordinary sky. It was the flammable surface waiting for the first spark.
An air-naval battle isn't won by admirals moving pens on a map. It's won in the air, by young men in metal and oil machines flying hundreds of miles per hour. To understand Midway, we need to understand the aircraft that dueled in those skies. They weren't just weapons, they were the embodiment of their nation's war philosophies. America's tools. Let's start with the giant, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy, four-engine bomber that operated from Midway Island itself. The B-17 was a symbol of American bombing doctrine, flying high, very high, above the range of enemy anti-aircraft artillery and dropping a massive bomb load. Its presence at Midway was an anomaly, an attempt to use a strategic bomber as a tactical naval weapon. On paper, it looked formidable. In practice, bombing a moving ship at 30,000 feet was like trying to hit an ant with a rock from the top of a building. The B-17s wouldn't sink any Japanese aircraft carriers, but their role would be different, more subtle and psychological. The mere fact of their existence forced the Japanese fleet to maneuver, to worry about threats coming from an altitude their fighters struggled to reach. They were a source of psychological chaos, an unorganized element that would contribute to the collapse of the Japanese timetable. Descending from high altitude to the death line, we find the tragic hero of this story, the Douglas TBD Devastator, the U.S. Navy's primary torpedo plane. By 1942, the Devastator was already a dinosaur, slow, with the maneuverability of a truck, and almost non-existent armor. To launch its torpedo, it had to fly low, slowly, and in a straight line, directly toward enemy anti-aircraft artillery and fighters. It was a suicide mission. Its torpedoes, the Mark 13, were notoriously defective, often sinking before reaching their target or simply failing to explode on impact. The pilots knew this, and yet they flew. The Devastator was an obsolete aircraft, crewed by men of timeless courage. Its value lay not in the ships it sank, but in the defense it drew. And who protected these men? The Grumman F4F Wildcat, the Navy's primary fighter. Compared to its direct adversary, the Wildcat resembled a middleweight boxer pitted against a martial arts master. It was slower, climbed with more difficulty, and was far less maneuverable than the Japanese Zero. In a one-on-one duel, a Wildcat pilot was at a serious disadvantage. But the Wildcat had its virtues, American virtues. It was robust, almost a tractor with wings. It had heavy armor around the cockpit and, crucially, self-sealing fuel tanks, lined with rubber that expanded to seal bullet holes, preventing catastrophic fires. A Wildcat could absorb an impressive amount of damage and still bring its pilot home. Furthermore, their pilots developed tactics to compensate for their shortcomings. The most famous was the Thach Weave, created by Lieutenant Commander John Thach. Two Wildcats flew in parallel and, when attacked from behind, turned toward each other. An enemy fighter pursuing one target would suddenly find itself in the sights of the other Wildcat. It was a tactic that replaced individual agility with team coordination. The Wildcat was not a duelist, it was a resilient bodyguard. The Blades of the Empire. Across the sky, Japan's machines, and at the top of the food chain, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero reigned supreme. The Zero was, in 1942, a legend, a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, extraordinarily light, incredibly agile, and with phenomenal range. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the Zero could dance through the air, outclassing any Allied fighter. Its combination of two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns gave it devastating firepower. But the Zero's genius was also its curse. To achieve this spectacular performance, its designers had sacrificed everything. There was no armor for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single well-placed shot could turn the agile fighter into a ball of fire. The Zero was a glass samurai, lethal on the offensive but terribly fragile on the defensive. And its greatest weakness was the same as Japan's. The loss of its veteran, irreparable pilots was a wound from which the nation would never recover. Finally, the tip of the Japanese offensive spear, the Aichi D3A Val, the standard dive bomber of the Imperial Navy. The Val was a weapon of deadly precision. With its fixed landing gear and robust construction, it could dive nearly vertically onto a ship, releasing its bomb with an accuracy that high-altitude bombers could only dream of. It was the Vals that crippled the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. At Midway, it would be the primary tool for destroying the island's defenses. But, like the Zero, the Val was vulnerable when surprised, especially after releasing its payload and attempting to escape the inferno of anti-aircraft fire it had unleashed. These were the pieces on the board: high-altitude giants, suicide torpedo bombers, rugged fighters, glass samurai, and precision divers. The stage was set for an aerial drama that would decide the future of the world.
First light on June 4th found the Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, about 240 miles northwest of Midway. At 4:30 a.m., the order was given. The first strike. 108 aircraft, a mix of Val dive bombers, Kate level bombers, configured for bombs, not torpedoes, and an escort of Zero fighters, roared from the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their target, Midway Island. Still in the dark, Midway was already on alert. Primitive radar had detected the approaching force. Every American plane capable of flying was scrambled. The B-17s climbed to meet the Japanese fleet. About 20 F-2A Buffalo and F4F Wildcat fighters, mostly obsolete and flown by Marines, scrambled to intercept the Japanese attack wave. What followed was a massacre. The Zeros, superior in every way, shattered Midway's fighter defenses. More than 2/3 of the American defenders were shot down. The Vals and Kates passed through and battered the island, bombing hangars, runways, and fuel depots. But Midway's defenses, though wounded, were not destroyed. The airbase remained operational. The Japanese attack leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, sent a fateful message back to Nagumo. A second strike is necessary. Meanwhile, Midway's planes encountered the Japanese fleet. The B-17s arrived first, bombing from high altitude. Their bombs kicked up massive columns of water around the carriers, forcing them into sharp evasive maneuvers, but without scoring a single direct hit. The attacks disorganized the Japanese, but did not harm them. Now began the most tragic and, paradoxically, most decisive act of the battle: the Devastators' attack. 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers, launched from the 3 American aircraft carriers, reached the Japanese fleet in disarray and without adequate fighter escort. The first to attack was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from Hornet. 15 planes. They flew low, level, straight into hell. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zeros, swooped down on them like hawks. One by one, the slow-moving Devastators were set ablaze, torn apart by cannonballs, and fell into the sea ablaze. None of them managed to launch their torpedoes. All 15 planes were lost. Only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the wreckage in a front-row seat for the rest of the battle. Next came Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6, from Enterprise. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. History repeated itself.
devastating losses. Of a total of 41 TBD Devastators that attacked that morning, only 6 returned. And most importantly, they failed to score a single hit on the Japanese carriers. A vain sacrifice? On paper, yes. 0 hits, near total annihilation. But in war, sometimes tactical defeat can create the opportunity for a strategic victory. The Devastators' suicide attacks, though futile in their direct results, had 3 crucial and unintended consequences. First, they forced the Japanese carriers to constantly maneuver, preventing them from launching their own counteroffensive. Second, they confirmed to Admiral Nagumo that there were indeed American carriers in the area, something his scouts had failed to find. And third, and most important of all, as they descended to annihilate the low-flying torpedo bombers, the Zero fighter patrol was drawn to sea level, far from its high-altitude covering position. They exhausted ammunition and fuel hunting the Devastators. The sky directly above the Japanese fleet became dangerously empty. At that very moment, Admiral Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. His first-wave planes were returning from Midway, needing to land. Their decks were filled with second-wave planes, armed with bombs to attack the island. But now, he knew the real enemy was the American aircraft carriers. He gave the order: rearm the planes, switch from cluster bombs to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. This order sealed their fate. The decks of the Japanese carriers became a chaos of bombs, torpedoes, fuel hoses, and hastily moved planes. They were at their most vulnerable. And then out of the clouds, they came. By sheer luck and the tenacity of their leader, Commander Wade McCluskey, 2 squadrons of SB Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet at that precise moment. They weren't on the original list of protagonists, but they became the executioners. Flying high, McCluskey saw the trail of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet and decided to follow it. It was the decision that won the battle. At 10:22 a.m., the Dauntless began their dive, nearly vertical. The sound of their engines was a piercing howl, the scream of the Valkyrie. And there were no Zeros to stop them. They were down below, finishing the job with the Devastators. The Japanese gunners looked up in horror. American bombers fell from the sky like lightning. The first bomb hit the aircraft carrier Kaga, then another, and then another. The bombs pierced the flight deck and exploded in the hangar below, detonating the fuel and ammunition being handled. The Kaga turned into a volcano. Simultaneously, the Dauntless from the Enterprise, led by Max Leslie, dove into the Soryu. The result was the same: multiple direct hits, uncontrollable fires. The flagship, the Akagi, the pride of Nagumo's fleet, was next. A single bomb placed with surgical precision was enough. It ignited the pile of armed and fueled aircraft on deck. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Kido Butai aircraft carriers were in flames, doomed. The naval might of the Imperial of Japan had been shattered. The men who survived the fires and explosions leapt into a sea covered in burning oil. Yamamoto's dream of victory had become a nightmare.
The battle was not yet completely over. The 4th and final Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, survived the initial attack and launched a desperate counteroffensive. Its planes managed to find and severely damage the American aircraft carrier Yorktown, which would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine. But it was the Dragon's last gasp. American planes, launched from Enterprise and from Yorktown itself before it was abandoned, found the Hiryu in the late afternoon. The pattern repeated itself. Dive bombs found their target. By nightfall, the Hiryu was also a floating incendiary. 4 fleet aircraft carriers lost in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They represented not only 2/3 of the combined fleet's carrier strength, but the heart of the Imperial Navy's offensive experience and spirit. The material loss was catastrophic. The human loss was even worse. Japan lost more than 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. Japan, with its limited industrial base, could never replace these ships and, crucially, these men as quickly as the United States. The Battle of Midway was more than a defensive victory. It was a turning point, a complete game-changer. The strategic initiative in the Pacific passed decisively and permanently from Japan to the United States. The threat to Hawaii and the American West Coast was eliminated. The tide of war, which had been flowing in only one direction for 6 months, had turned. From Midway onward, the United States would go on the offensive, beginning with the brutal campaign on Guadalcanal just 2 months later. Japan would be forced into a long and bloody defensive war, a war of attrition that it could not win. The victory was not a miracle. It was the result of courage, sacrifice, and above all, intelligence. The intelligence that allowed Nimitz to understand the enemy's plan. The courage of the Devastator pilots who flew to their deaths and unknowingly created the golden opportunity. And the skill of the dauntless pilots who executed the final blow with devastating precision in those few minutes that changed the world. Four ships burned. 4 names that marked a moment of no return. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. They weren't just ship names. They were inscriptions on the tombstones of an empire, symbols of an arrogance consumed by the fire it itself helped create. The night of June 4th, 1942 fell over a different ocean. The smell of smoke and burning oil stretched for miles. In the silence that followed the roar of engines and the crash of explosions, the Pacific was no longer the same. The balance of power, which had seemed as solid as steel, had evaporated in a few hours. History is often seen as a slow process, a river that carves the landscape over centuries. But sometimes, history is a waterfall, a point of abrupt drop, where everything changes in an instant. Midway was that waterfall. In the end, the battle was won by a combination of factors. The cryptanalysis that turned an ambush into a counter-ambush. The obsolescence of an aircraft that became the perfect bait. The fragility of another that, though lethal, couldn't withstand the punishment. And luck. The luck of a squadron commander who, lost and low on fuel, decided to follow a single ship and found the heart of the enemy fleet. That day, the sky over Midway was both judge and executioner. And when the smoke cleared, the tide had indeed turned. And history had been rewritten with the blood of pilots and the steel of machines that dared to defy fate.